Thank you very much for coming tonight. This is the first event in this shop, which actually makes a really great space. So it's the first of many, we hope. Certainly this is part of a series of our partnership with Chelsea Green Publishers, and we've got some more events. There's on your chairs little leaflets for other events that are happening both here and up at the Trust at Dartington. So we hope you'll join us for other events as well. We'll last about an hour, and there'll be discussion, and then some time for questions at the end. And of course, the book and other wonderful books are available to buy as well this evening. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to hand over to Simon Fairlie and Will Kemp from our Dartington communications team.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming, and thank you Simon for being here. It's an absolute honour to have you with us tonight. The new book is really exciting, Going to Seed, and maybe we could kick off by thinking a bit about me asking you what brought this book about. I mean, it's a very personal book, I think, and obviously took a lot of effort, energy, and I don't know, you had to sort of share personal things in it. That must have been quite challenging.
Well, I tried to make it as impersonal as possible, really, because it's supposed to be a kind of like it's a history of it's not a history of my life, but a history of my times. You see what I mean? I was 18 in 1968, and I was horribly infected by the movement of the times. In fact, I thought I thought the revolution was around the corner, as indeed a lot of other people of my generation, and it wasn't quite. And so the book's a bit of an exploration of where those ideas led, all the ideas that flourished in between about 66 and 74, I guess, but actually got more shape in the 70s than they did in they kind of flowered in the 60s in a very zany way, but they actually took on more shape in the 70s, I feel. And where it's an examination of where they led to, but from the perspective of my own experience rather than an academic study. So it's a kind of bit of a squintish view of it all. And yeah, there's quite a number of things, a lot of good stuff that came out of that era, and quite a lot of rather tacky stuff as well. And I lived through both of it and survived. Yeah. But I didn't really mean to write it. I was on holiday with my missus, who's a painter, and it was a long holiday, 2 months in France, and she spent the entire time painting women in balconies. There's a whole series. Actually, you go to ipaint.org and you'll see a wonderful selection of, I think it's 10 French women on their balconies, starting early in the morning, running through lunchtime and going to the evening. And actually they're a lot better than this book. But but I had to do something while she was beavering away, and so I thought I'd write about my youth, and which I did. And then Chelsea Green got hold of it and said, write more. And I'm not sure. Probably the youth bit is the best bit. I don't know.
Maybe we could hear a bit of that initial.
You want to hear a bit?
Anything?
Yeah,
That might be a good.
Well, there's a bit I'd like to read, but it was my favourite bit really, because it's all about. Well, there are some people here who are almost as old as I am, and so then it may ring a bell to them that this is about what life was like in the 50s. It's I come in the middle because it'd be far too long otherwise. Oh dear. Oh, well. I've got a cataract, okay. so I can't see very well, but I'll probably manage. So I start in the middle. In common with most this is our household in the 1950s, when I was 8-ish. In common with most households, we didn't have a fridge, yet the amount of food wasted was minimal. Like many women who came of age during the war, my mother couldn't bear to see food thrown away. Everything that wasn't eaten was served up again as bubble and squeak or rissoles. Butter papers were meticulously folded and kept in a drawer for greasing the frying pan. Some molecules of fat in the chip pan were probably 10 years old. My mother held that fresh bread warmed from the oven was bad for you, whereas I reckoned it was an old wives' tale designed to ensure that we ate up all the old crusts first. Other than cooked dishes, the only common foodstuff we used that derived any benefit from being kept in a fridge was fresh milk, and since the milkman came every day, there was no shortage of it. The problem was how to deal with any surplus before it went off, and the answer was to make milk puddings. Semolina, rice pudding, custard, junket and flummeries were no accident of English cookery, but the easiest way to use up a perishable surplus, while other favourites such as bread and butter pudding and eggy bread incorporated stale loaves into the salvage exercise. Food was simple and mostly indigenous in the sense that it could be grown in Britain, though bananas and oranges were plentiful. Fresh peaches were unavailable outside places like the Savoy Hotel. Green peppers were weird, and kiwis and avocado pears were unheard of. Soft fruits such as strawberries, raspberries and blackcurrants were only available in season, making them a treat. Spaghetti was almost unknown outside Hampstead. A long blue packet of the stuff, adorned with medals and Italian script, lay unopened at the back of my mother's food cupboard for years, along with a dusty bottle of Mazola cooking oil. The fats she used were bacon grease, dripping, lard, suet, butter and stork margarine. Most meat was from pasture-fed livestock because the price of wheat and barley was higher than it is today, so feeding it to animals was extravagant. Chicken was therefore very expensive and a treat that we would only have at Christmas and Easter. Eggs were mainly reserved for Sundays. Pork was more affordable since pigs were partly fed on food waste, but the most common meats were beef and lamb, the reverse of the situation today. In common with many families, our diet at home was structured on a weekly basis around a joint of beef, lamb or occasionally pork. Cooked and eaten with sacramental reverence for Sunday lunch, along with vegetables, Yorkshire pudding, potatoes and gravy. It would be reincarnated on Monday as cold cuts, on Tuesday as shepherd's pie, on Wednesday as rissoles, and on Thursday as dripping sandwiches. Friday was often fish, and Saturday might be something that, like liver sausage. Oh, this is getting a bit longer than I thought. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit and go to the factor that really made the British way of life in the 50s unsustainable was a resource supplied entirely on British soil, coal. Nobody was concerned at the time, but coal emits much larger volumes of carbon dioxide per unit of energy generated than oil or gas, and hence causes more global warming. By abandoning coal in favour of gas, and through improvements in technological efficiency, today we only produce 2/3 as much greenhouse gas per person as we did in the 1950s. Bravo! This is a cause for rejoicing, until you include the figures for UK consumption, i.e. all the goods we import, notably from China, in which case the figures bounce back more or less to where it was in the 1950s. In other words, despite relinquishing coal, despite all the improvements in efficiency, and despite the fact that we now generate a fair amount of renewable energy, we're still causing just as much global warming as we were in the 1950s. Maybe we should be looking at the 1950s way of life and seeing what aspects could be emulated. Perhaps we already are. Note, for example, the return of the shopping bag. There is a feeling amongst some who can't remember the 50s that they were colourless and grim. It is true that in cities such as London and Manchester were black with soot, and the programme of scrubbing them up in subsequent decades did a lot to brighten up the urban environment. Aside from London buses and phone boxes, primary colours were in short supply because few things were made from plastic. High-vis jackets had not been invented, and day-glow yellow was unimaginable. Flashing neon lights belonged in Piccadilly. The evocation of gloom is compounded by the fact that most photos from the 50s are black and white, whereas colour film arrived in people's cameras just in time to capture the swinging 60s. But the sun shone then, as it does now. Waves beat upon the white cliffs of Dover. Flowers blossomed in spring. Corn 3 foot high turned yellow in summer. Apples ripened in autumn. Stars twinkled at night, brighter than they do now. And Christmas trees were aglow with real candles. Bells rang in churches. Jukeboxes blared in chrome-lined milk bars, and the BBC played music while you worked. Girls jived in flared skirts, with boys sporting loud ties, and choir boys had rosy cheeks and crisp white surplices. There were no punks with purple hair, but well-to-do widows painted their lips scarlet and draped dead foxes around their necks.
Great. You remember that time in the 50s with such vividness. It's very nice to.
Yes,
kind of
well
be
that
taken
was a nice
back
bit.
there.
I could read a bit about boarding school. That's not so nice.
Yeah. I wondered, so you kind of talked about those things. I wonder which parts of those can we realistically bring forward to our time now? That seemed to be what you were pointing towards at the end there.
Yeah, well, there's a whole preamble about before that, because I couldn't read the whole thing. It's already a bit long, I thought. About the fact we didn't have a car, and yet it took pretty much. We lived near Lewes, in the countryside near Lewes, with a good bus service. It took about the same time to get to the centre of London from our house in the middle of the countryside as it does now. The amount of waste generated was negligible compared with what was now. There's none of this irritating plastic stuff that you just can't help but buy and so forth. So there's all that as well. And yeah, I think there's an awful lot about the 1950s that we could revert to without anybody suffering very much. In fact, mostly it's irritating things that you could get rid of.
Yeah. Well, so that was the 50s, and,
Yeah.
and you enjoyed that time.
Except at boarding school. Yeah.
Except at
But I'm not going to read you the bit about
okay.
boarding school. It's too horrific. It's
Yeah, and
well, it's not as bad as George Orwell's, but boarding school. But
I wonder what the debates. We're going to go on to talk a bit about farming later, and this talk is part of our Farming for the Future series. I wondered if we could talk a bit about the debates around food production and farming at that time. That would be really interesting to hear, and then to compare it to the more kind of the more recent approaches, like the ones that we've been looking at Schumacher College. Regenerative farming, agroecological approaches to farming, and the work that you do as well. So
yes, well, I think if you read something like James Reedbanks' latest book, English Pastoral, he starts off by describing what was basically kind of 1950s, which is type farming, which his grandfather did, which was much more in tune with, far less dependent on fertilizers and particularly on pesticides, just at the cusp of moving from horse-drawn to tractor-drawn, and much smaller farms and loads far more family farms. I mean, I'm mostly conversant with dairy because that's what I do, and I knew a bird called Brian who died last year, actually, an old boy and when he was farming in the 1950s, his parents, they had 5 cows, and that basically provided the basis of their living. The milk, you put the milk out every day. Milk marketing board came and collected it, took it off to the milk train or whatever it was, and you got a guaranteed price for it, and you got a cheque coming in every week. Whereas most agricultural things you get the cheque once a year, And of course there were milk rounds and so forth, and it was all more localised, but not everything was brilliant then. You know, I mean, a lot of the beef was coming in from Argentina, and I mean, it's mostly pasture fed, as I said, but it was I mean, we had a joint, but I lived in a fairly middle class household. How many people in Britain couldn't afford a joint, I don't know, but you could never have produced that level of meat consumption for everybody in Britain from just pasture-fed beef and sheep. It was all coming in Argentina and New Zealand and so forth. And then what happened was that the wheat and barley got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and they're still pretty much the same price. Well, they've just gone up now, but up until about a year ago, they were hardly increased in price in the last 30 or 40 years. And so farms have had to get bigger and more mechanised. And as grain has got cheaper, it's become much more cheaper to feed pigs and chickens in factory farms than it has to produce grass-fed meat. And then, of course, a high percentage of pork was fed on waste food back in those days, and that was banned basically by the government after the foot and mouth crisis in 2001. And in fact, I am at this moment embroiled in a battle with AFA, which is the animal, well, it's the government vet lot, because we're feeding our waste food. The place where I live, we're feeding our waste food to our pigs, and we went on the radio, and Jill, my partner, God bless her, decided to announce to the world we were doing this, and so they came down on us. Not exactly like a ton of bricks, because in fact all the vets we've spoken to are really sympathetic, and they're all foreign. They're either Croatian or Spanish or Italian, and they're all actually really pissed off with England, because it was the British foot and mouth disease which brought in the ban on swill, and then it spread to the whole of Europe, and so all other countries that were managing all their just feeding food to pigs quite without any incident at all. A huge industry of food recycling just got abolished, that's like that, because the English were too hopeless at managing their farming, and the vets were sort of saying to me, but at the same time they were saying, well, you have to obey the rules, unfortunately. So at the moment we're appealing for a derogation. We've been adopted. Our pigs, God bless them, have been adopted by Coventry University Agroecology Department as an experiment, and Coventry are applying for a derogation so that we can feed our kitchen food to our pigs. I mean, I should say that I live in a place which is a little bit like a mini Dartington, which does courses and hosts conferences and weddings and things, and I do the farming for, I do the dairy farming and the pigs, and my colleagues do the veg to provide the food for that.
It's interesting that you had the University of Coventry, did you say, connection? Because those students, they obviously get around. They came down to us quite recently, visited Schumacher College and the growing spaces at Dartington, I think, mainly to get that kind of sense of a working growing space, or a working space that employs these kind of ecological practices firsthand. So yeah, they obviously get around. We've talked about the 50s a bit, and we don't have that long. So where do we go from there? 50s, 60s? Should we just do it per decade?
Well, no, we never get to the end of it. There's a little, my little story about Thatcherism.
Yeah.
I'll do that, shall I?
Yeah.
Because it's very short, you see. I'm a bit worried that people fall into sleep if I read anything as long as the previous one.
And while you get ready, I'll just say we'll open for questions for the last 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
So start thinking now.
Okay, so there's a whole lot of stuff earlier on about the poll tax rally and being evicted from houses and things like that, and also about how it was a sort of the Thatcher, the 80s were a bit of a doldrum era for the hippie movement, if you want to call it that. Everybody was full of beans and enthusiasm during the 60s and 70s, and then towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s, it all started to go a bit sour, and people, and then of course it was far hard to get money because after 74, because it was all in depression, and then lots of people had babies and spent most of their time trying to keep their family together, and things like that, and the idealism sort of sapped away, and then it actually met a resurgence in the 90s when a new generation of radicals came along. But I thought I'd read this bit, but of course it's a bit trivial really, but never mind. The event in my life that summed up the ethos of Thatcherism occurred a few years later when I'd moved to Somerset. I was returning on the train from Oxford, but dozed off, missed a connection, and ended up at midnight at Salisbury Station, with the next train to Yeovil at 6 in the morning. The railway staff wouldn't allow me to wait at the station, even though I had a ticket. It was bitterly cold, at least -8 degrees centigrade, and I had no sleeping bag, inadequate clothing, and not enough money for a hotel. I phoned up people I knew in Salisbury, but there was no reply. I got a number from Director Inquiries for a night shelter, but that too didn't answer. Suddenly, I was faced with the challenge of how not to die of hypothermia. I decided to try the police. Perhaps if I made a sufficient nuisance of myself, they'd put me in a cell for the night. I rang the doorbell of the police station, and a voice came over the intercom. "How can we help you?" I told them my predicament, and they said, sorry, they couldn't do anything, they were speaking from 40 miles away at Bath. I wandered down the road, peering into people's gardens to see if there was an unlocked shed that I could borrow for the night. Then I came to the site of the Old Manor Mental Hospital. I walked in, and every building I peered into was empty. I tried one of the sash windows. It was unlocked. I opened it, and a blast of warm air hit me in the face. I clambered into a large, completely bare room that was so hot, I kid you not, that I had to sleep with the window wide open to the frosty air. It was, I mused as I went to sleep, the very epitome of Thatcherism. Closing down a hospital, but leaving the heating on. But it saved my bacon that night.
Be interested to hear what it is about that story that you wanted to put in the book and read it tonight. I mean, I presume there's a political undertone to this that you might want to.
Well, I wouldn't like to put in any more words than I've already put in. I wouldn't like to spin an entire an edifice of critique about Thatcherism on that story. It just kind of, sort of, those down hospitals. But it was, it was a pretty miserable era, really.
Should we talk about what that meant for farming and food production at that time?
Yes, I don't really know, to be honest, because I wasn't terribly involved in it. But I mean, obviously, the whole process of agro-industrialization was gathering speed bit by bit, and we joined the common market, which was. Well, I mean, it gets slammed a bit, but the fact is that after the war, before the war, we were producing only about less than 40% of our food, and then during the war, of course, that went up hugely because it was very difficult to get any of this grain coming in from the States. I mean, basically ever since 1870, when they built the railways across the States, and because of the repeal of the Corn Laws, English agriculture had been undercut by the import of grain from Canada and the United States. And during the war, this it was very difficult to get it through because of the U-boats, and so we had to actually suddenly revert to something that was really a bit more, well, certainly more local and a bit more agroecological. In fact, that you had to really save every bit of fertility you got. It was quite interesting that the government decided that the little grain they had, spare grain, was to go to dairy cows rather than to pigs or any other meat, simply because dairy cows are the most efficient way of converting food into animal protein. And so milk wasn't, I believe I'm right in saying that milk wasn't rationed, well, nearly everything else was. And then the other main animal food that we focused on was pigs, because there was a big campaign to feed all the food waste to pigs, with the result that by the end of the war we'd gone up, I think, to about 60 or 70% self-sufficient. But also coming out of that was the fear about the needing to be self-sufficient in food and food security, and that was widespread throughout Europe, because Europe had suffered even more than Britain, especially after the war with food shortages. And so the philosophy of the early common market, before it became the EU, was to produce as much as possible, which did indeed bring Britain's food self-sufficiency up to nearly 80%, but at an environmental cost of pumping loads of pesticides and fertilisers and so forth, and destroying a lot of small family farms. But then in the last 20 years or so, it's then dropped again as a kind of neoliberal free trade philosophy has dominated, and we're now down to about 60% self-sufficient again. And then, of course, now there's a big debate about when we're turning the basically farmers are being subsidised to produce what they call public goods, but food isn't regarded as a public good. Not if you're an economist, it's not. And so there is a worry that we will be farming in a highly ecological manner, but producing very little food, and basically outsourcing our environmental impacts to other countries around the world. And sort of, I guess, Thatcherism, introducing the emphasising free trade and neoliberalism and so forth, was one stage in that whole process.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned wheat there, and obviously we're facing that issue again today with the war in Ukraine. I think it was also, is it sunflower oil? I went to Sainsbury's recently, and there were signs up everywhere saying, beware, some of the products may not contain sunflower oil anymore.
Yes.
That was interesting.
Well, you may find yourself eating the same fats as my mum did if you're not careful. Well, we did.
Should we talk about dairy farming in a bit more detail, and because that's obviously an interest of yours, and something.
Well, I mean, I now run
today. Yeah, what you're doing now.
I live at Monkton Wylde Court, which, as I said, is a sort of mini Dartington near Axminster, and we it's an old Victorian pile, and it's a charity, and we provide courses and conferences. We've got 42 beds, and we try and keep the place going. And as far as I know, it's the only kind of intentional community in Britain that provides a living for all the people who live there. Though, frankly, during the pandemic, it got pretty difficult to do that, and we're still recovering because obviously hospitality is our main thing. But my role there is to run the farm, which is a very small farm. There's only 5 acres belonging to us and another 3 that I rent. I would love more, but I can't get hold of it. So we run. I run a dairy and the pigs, and then my colleagues run about an acre of vegetable garden, and we produce. Well, basically, we're self-sufficient, but for about feeding about 25 to 30 people a day on average, which is a much better scale to be self-sufficient at than nuclear family scale. I mean, a cow just doesn't work for a family scale unless it's a very poor cow. And I produce. Well, I did have. Prior to the pandemic, we had 3 cows. I've gone down to 2, but actually the production has gone up. So, and the 2 cows produce between them 8,000 litres of Jersey milk a year, which is enough to feed us and a bit of surplus, which we turn into what we call cobbit, which in fact is a kind of halloumi, but you're not allowed to call it. So we've given it a nice English name. It works quite well. It's about the only bit of agriculture I've ever done in my life which did work well. It took me a long time to get there. I'll read a little bit if I may.
Yeah,
About it. Right. Okay. Do you want to hear about the state of hippie decay that was in before I got there? Yeah, I think we can all do that. When I arrived, most of the infrastructure for providing this, I better start at the beginning. Unlike a nuclear family, a community provides an economic foundation for a viable farming operation at a scale appropriate to its size. Monkton Wylde, with its quota of visitors and volunteers, is well suited to a small herd of 3 cows, and indeed has supported just such a herd since 1982, apart from the 2 years prior to my arrival. In fact, a functioning micro-dairy goes back to 1941, when the school began. It did originally start as a free anarchist school. It got 2 anarchists and had to be closed down. It may well be the oldest dairy enterprise of its size in Britain. When I arrived, most of the infrastructure for providing this was still in place. A milking parlour with stalls for 6 cows, cowsheds and a small dairy. Not so long ago there were thousands of such steadings around the country, supporting up to a dozen cows. Every stately home possessed one, and so did countless humble small holdings. The cash flow of family farms was guaranteed by regular payments from the Milk Marketing Board for a few churns left out for collection every morning. But by 2010, virtually all had either been left to go derelict or else been converted into holiday cottages. Monkton Wylde's dairy farm was on the way to a similar fate. There were all the symptoms of a hippie commune in decline. The milking parlour and cowsheds were full of plastic guttering, unused beehives, broken tools, old timber and bags of rubbish. One room was stuffed with detritus from courses in which children were taught to manufacture hideous contraptions out of yoghurt pots, toilet rolls, plastic bags, and all the other effluvia of capitalist culture. A tile was missing from the roof above the beehives. Instead of replacing the tile, a 10-minute job, somebody had placed corrugated iron inside to divert the dripping water away from the beehives onto a tie beam, which as a result had rotted away. The state of the land was similar. The pasture, which hadn't been grazed or mown for 2 years, was thick with yellowing tussocks, while briar and bracken patches were invading from all sides. Of course, some people like this now, but no. A half-acre orchard was completely engulfed in 6-foot-high brambles and bracken. The fencing was in total disrepair. Even today, if you dig into the earth through decades of topsoil, you're likely to uncover hippie archaeology. Rotting carpets, plastic sheeting or woven tarpaulins that disintegrate into thousands of polypropylene strands, indicating that the ground had once been mulched or was the site of an old sweat lodge. All of this decay could be remedied. It was not a priority of the community, which had more pressing matters to address on the main house, but the rent I was paying Monkton, I'm going to skip that bit. My old friend Jill Barron, now a well-known painter, came to visit, decided to stay and help me get set up. 11 years later, I'm glad to say she's still here. Within a few months, we bought one Jersey cow and borrowed another. Within a few years, we had rented a further 3 acres and milked 3 Jerseys. Now, a decade later, the dairy is still functioning, usually with 3 cows, although we went down to 2 during the pandemic. Our oldest, Folly, has been with us 10 years and is still in top form. After my half-cocked attempts at agriculture in previous years, it's good to have tumbled on something that works. The reason it works is because the cows, the land and the community are in near-perfect symbiosis. The cows benefit because we provide them with the winter feed that they cannot harvest for themselves in the form of hay, and with medical care, and with a more painless death than nature can offer. In return, they each give us about 4,000 litres of rich, creamy milk a year, containing enough fat, protein and calories to feed 4 people indefinitely. That's 4 people for 1 cow. They produce this by grazing Britain's most abundant, easily grown and biodiverse crop, grass, keeping bracken and brambles at bay and letting the sunlight in to allow meadow plants to flourish, along with butterflies and other insects. Moreover, about 85% of the nutrients that a cow ingests come out her rear end. She harvests biomass, chips and shreds it, bioactivates and digests it, transports it, and extrudes it as the manure that's vital for our acre of vegetable garden, all without using a gram of fossil fuel. Meanwhile, the whey from our cheese, along with vegetable and food waste, goes to feed our pigs. Our cows are the backbone of a traditional mixed farming system that enables us to provide 30 people a day with healthy home-produced food, and to do so with 0 packaging and 0 food miles. Perhaps, given today's nucleated social structure, this cannot be widely replicated, but it can be scaled up. There's no reason why schools, hospitals and prisons couldn't run their own dairy farm, providing, in the case of school children, the free milk that Thatcher took away, a nourishing and educational alternative to sugary carbonated beverages. That was precisely what Monkton Wylde did when it was a school feeding 70 pupils and staff from the milk of 6 cows. And what if villages reclaimed some ownership of their land, and members of the communities supported the agriculture that flourished around them? That's what real community-supported agriculture should look like. Not just green hippie types driving miles to pick up their ethically sound vegetables, but every rural settlement with its farm shop and its milk dispensing machine selling all the fresh dairy produce, meat, bread, fruit and vegetables that its farmers can sensibly produce. This must surely be the direction rural people should be taking if we are to eliminate fossil fuels and plastic packaging, while safeguarding the complex relationship we have forged with the natural world through traditional agriculture. The alternative looks increasingly likely to be a diet of hydroponic and lab-grown junk food, courtesy of a hydrogen-powered urban biotechnocracy. I'll better end there.
We could, following on from that, we could talk about veganism, but maybe I won't ask you now. But that was a question I was going to ask you, was about how do we scale this up? How does it work? You know, you've got your micro dairy example, and you did touch on that. So I wondered, for urban people live in urban environments, how does that work? How do we scale this across the board?
Yes, well, you can't scale it up locally. Well, I think we need to get about half the people who are in the towns out of towns and into the countryside, but that's a different issue. And we probably will have to, because that's where everything comes from. at the moment it all comes from oil and it's all brought in and refined in towns, but our energy in future and all our materials, if we're going to stop using fossil fuels, which I hope we do, then where else does it come from? It comes from the countryside, and that's where wealth is going to be in the future. And I think we're going to need more people sort of working that, especially if we haven't got much in the way of fossil fuels and energy to power machinery. Then we're going to need to use more muscle, frankly. But I'm not predicting the entire collapse of towns. But the first step really is all around London and most big conurbations of the thing called the Green Belt. And it in terms of food provision, it's utterly wasted. It's for the most part, it's people buy horses and the odd sheep, the nags sort of grazing under pylons with the land getting more and more full of dock and stuff. Basically because the people who own the land are sitting on it, waiting for it to, in the hope that they'll be able to develop it at some point. And what we really need, and there are thankfully more and more people pushing for this, is some sort of planning policy that directs the use of that land towards small-scale agriculture, producing local food for people in the towns. And of course the other huge advantage of that is especially if it's linked to schools and so forth, is it puts urban kids in touch with where their food comes from. I mean, notoriously they don't know what an egg is, so you can, it surely makes sense to get some of quite a lot of the land that's around towns, and if farms are twinned with schools within London or Manchester or whatever, there's a huge benefits to be got from that. And to have a school producing its own milk and its own vegetables and its own fruit and whatever, or its own honey, I can't think of anything that's more educational, frankly.
Perhaps it's time to open up to questions from the audience. I don't know if anyone's got any. Straight away. Yes, on there in the nice.
Your blueprint there can mathematically surely only work if most of that land is growing food that is directly eaten by humans. You talked about efficiency earlier.
Yeah.
The most efficient way of using land is to take stuff grown on that land and feed it directly to humans, not pass it through an animal, lose a lot of energy, and then eat the animal. And yet I can see no mood in the British livestock farming industry to reduce herds and flocks. I can see nothing in the incentive payment schemes that is going to encourage farmers to reduce herds and flocks. So do you accept my premise, and how do you think we tackle that problem?
Yes, well, I accept your premise in terms of grains, yeah, definitely. I mean, feeding grains to beef is ridiculously inefficient, and feeding it to other animals is not. I mean, you need to be feeding a certain amount, because in order to ensure in a bad year that you've got enough grain to feed everybody, you've got to sow enough grain which will result in there being a surplus in good years. Do you see what I mean? It's called the feed buffer. It puts a bit of elasticity into the market. Otherwise, if you just said, right, we only need this much grain, we're not going to feed any to animals, and then you had a crap year, then people would go hungry, right? So you need a certain amount of grain, and then you get a certain amount of spoilt grain or whatever, or spoilt stuff, which is good to feed to animals. But in principle, I agree with you, yeah. And I agree with you as well that there's not much appetite from livestock farmers to reduce that, apart from the pasture-fed people, the pasture-fed beef people. But I mean, the only thing that will change it is the price of feed. and the price of fertiliser. And that is precisely what's been happening in the last 6 months or so. The price of gas has gone up, which means the price of fertiliser has gone up. And the price of feed has gone up because of that and because of the war in Ukraine. And a lot of farmers are now looking and saying, well, what do we do? Maybe, and it's not just a question of the expense of feed, which is really hitting the English pig industry at the moment, but also the expense of fertiliser, which means that they're starting to look at using either manure or lays, if you know what lays are, clover, grass. Basically, organic farming relies on a rotation of grass and whatever your crop is, and the grass mostly needs to have quite a lot of clover or some other legume in it to bring in the nitrogen, and you can just plough that in or disc it in or whatever with a sort of a vegan system of agriculture, or you can feed it through ideally cows, ideally dairy cows because they're most efficient, and most of what dairy cows eat, most of the nitrogen, the other stuff comes out the other end, plus any nitrogen in the clover, in its roots and stolons, isn't eaten by the cows, and so a traditional, a lot of traditional organic farming, that wasn't called organic farming, but just was based on a rotation between grass and your wheat or potatoes or whatever other crops, and the grass would be fed to dairy cows. Ideally, it's dairy cows, could be to beef, but it's more efficient. And if we do, if gas comes in short supply, and heaven knows it needs to get in short supply, you need to stop using it, then what happens to the fertiliser industry? The fertiliser industry, in order to produce artificial fertiliser without oil or gas, they basically need to produce hydrogen, and that needs renewable electricity, and then they can, through a process of electrolysis, they can create hydrogen, and then they can create ammonia, and then they can create artificial nitrogen fertilisers. It can be done. That they're trying to do it at the moment, but the trouble is it's very expensive, and it's competing with all the other requirements for hydrogen from other sectors of the economy that are all trying to decarbonise, and they're all saying, oh great, we can do it, we can make steel using hydrogen, we can run our lorries using hydrogen, we can make our fertiliser using hydrogen. The amount of electricity they're going to need to do that is huge, and even if they do succeed in doing it, it's probably going to be rather expensive, in which case any farmer looking at the expense, and this is actually happening now, a lot of farmers are actually looking at the expense of fertiliser, which has more than doubled in the last year, and saying, well, actually, if I plant clover, that's a little, all I've got to do is plant clover, and that will give me nitrogen as well. And so we could be seeing quite a return to organic farming, simply for economic reasons rather than any ideological reasons. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe not, but I hope so.
We have a couple of people. You put your hand up, I think, and then I've seen Jonathan at the back there, so go ahead.
Simon, I remember when you were here talking to us in Totnes maybe 12, 15 years ago.
Oh, heavens.
A long time ago,
yes.
Anyway. Your vision for the future of this island being self-sustaining in food included much less meat eating and all the good agricultural land being used for grains or legumes, and the sheep and cows and goats sort of banished to less fertile land. Do you still feel that? Because I mean, you've chosen to be a dairy farmer, and you're talking as if
I don't think I entirely thought that then, but because no, I mean, I see a role in mainly dairy cows, to be honest, within an organic rotation on arable land, because if all organic farming needs grass or green manure, and it certainly livestock aren't essential, but they do not exact a huge toll on that sort of system, and they produce a much wider variety of protein than we can produce in this country, which is why a lot of people I know who are vegan bring a lot of food in from the other side of the world. I mean, you can live on beans and the small number of beans that you can grow in this country. People like Hodmedod are doing a really good job of examining, of research into that. But no, I think there's definitely a place for dairy, and there's a place for pigs, because there's a huge amount of waste food. I mean, there was a woman called Hannah van Zanten wrote a paper, and her calculation is that if you eat a completely vegan diet, that diet is producing about 129 kilos a year of food processing waste. Like potato skins off crisps or whatever it is. The stuff that's left behind after you make oat milk. Right, what happens to that? Well, it goes to cows. In all, for a whole diet, it's 129 kilos, which produces, if you feed it to animals, some 10 kilos of meat a year or more, and even more if you fed it to dairy cows. That's a not negligible amount of nourishment, and some of which is going to already feeding livestock, but the whole kitchen and catering waste stuff is going into anaerobic digestion at the moment, which is simply not, keeping it in the food chain is much more valuable, really.
Jonathan?
Thank you, Simon. I'm experiencing a good deal of fellow feeling here as a former, both as a boarding school survivor and as a previous resident of Monkton Wylde.
Mm-hmm. All right.
I used to have forearms like Popeye from milking the cows manually. It seems to me that I want to make the proposition that the world, the vision that you're presenting is becoming progressively less outrageous, like progressively more feasible.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we will necessarily choose the path you're describing, but actually we will choice. My feeling is, as we watch the global supply chains dislocate and impacts of climate change, like it seems to me that what seemed to be a somewhat idealistic utopian vision is actually becoming rather, certainly much more plausible.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I make that proposition.
Yes, well, I think so. It's as long as it doesn't all go bang first. And there are a huge number of people to deal with. I can't say I'm terribly optimistic. I'd like to be. I do agree with you. It's well, as I was saying to the gentleman here, the main factor is the increase in any increase in the price of petrol, gas, if that happens, and as far as farming is concerned, the increase in the price of fertilizer will influence people in that direction. But one's also got to recognise that organic farming simply doesn't produce as much yield-wise as the chemical stuff, and effectively what that means is eating a lot less meat. There's no doubt about it. But I find myself in an odd position because if I'm talking with industrial farmers, I'd say we've got to eat a lot less meat, and if I'm talking with people at the vegan end of the spectrum, I say no, that's not the best way out of the, so I'm in the middle. Not often am I in the middle. Normally, I'm at one end of it.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have two. If I could sneak two questions in. One's easy to formulate, the second's a bit harder. The first one is I'm attending a course at Schumacher at the moment run by Martin Crawford about forest what role that played, if you saw any role for that. The second point was more about the 50% of the population that comes out of cities into the agricultural, rural areas, which I think you're right. My calculations lead to the same conclusions. But then you're still having to produce a surplus to feed the other people that stay in the cities,
Yes.
which means tax on the surplus, which means a centralised state, which means the maintenance of a military apparatus and a war machine, which competes with other nation states.
You've been reading old what's his name, haven't you?
Who?
Oh, I've forgotten his name now. Against the Grain. Have you been
James Scott.
James Scott,
Course,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I don't know about the centralised state. I'll have a think about that. What was the first question again?
Forest farming, which is
yes. Well, I did want to go and see when I was writing a book on meat. This was about 10 years ago. I did want to go and see Martin's thing, but he had a 6-month waiting list, and so I'd never actually seen it. But he did give me some figures. I've yet to be convinced that this country, with its current climate, can produce much in the way of nuts and things. I mean, like in France, the chestnut belt ends round about halfway between Avignon and Lyon. That's the northernmost bit where economically chestnuts are produced. Walnuts, they're produced in the Périgord and around there, which is about halfway up France, still south of the Loire. Anything, if they were economically viable, they'd move further north in France, but they don't, because they need quite hot weather. The only ones that really work in Britain, I think, is hazelnuts. And
squirrels get those.
And you've got the squirrel issue with that. But I wouldn't like to. I wouldn't like to take that up with Martin because I haven't been and seen his place, and I'm sure he's doing really interesting stuff.
You'd want to see the yield figures, would you?
I'd want to. Well, he didn't give me some yield figures, which I mean simply weren't up to scratch. I mean, the walnuts are the most interesting because they've got a very high fat content, and of course, fat is a particular issue, and is one reason for. Well, again, that's going to rise. We can't get sunflower oil at the supermarket any longer, and we're all going to stop eating palm oil because it's just moving in, and we don't want to eat soybean oil. Then there is a lot of animal fat that is simply wasted in this country at the moment. The stuff I was brought up on, and it was absolutely fine. I don't complain about it. Suet puddings. Whoa.
Well, place to end on, I think. So.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing you speak tonight. It's really great. I should say that we have copies of the book available, going to seed from right there, and Graham, I think, is on hand. He mentioned that if you're a member of Dartington, you get a 10% discount, so that's worth bearing in mind. What else do I need to tell you? This talk is part of our series Farming for the Future, and the next one in the series is Ben Raskin next, I think it's the 26th of May. He'll be talking all about wood chip online that time. And the previous talks in the series are all available on our YouTube channel at Dartington Trust. So do check those out if you're interested in hearing more. as we've mentioned a bit, this is part of a broader programme of learning at Dartington relating to regenerative farming. So there's a master's degree in regenerative farming, which is ongoing at the moment, starts in January again next year. And the undergrad, the BSc in regenerative farming, starts in September. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, do check out our website, dartington.org. I think that's everything I meant to say. So, Simon, thank you so much again for coming down.
Well, thank you very
And,
much.
yeah.
Can I say how nice